Yeah, I'll react to that, sure. Ready? Hey guys, my name's Connor for new. Original link to the video, top of the description, right below that. The other links. World War II, great channel. Hey Indy. Episode 10, I'd recommend watching the previous episodes. That's obviously up to you though. Molotov's heel on Finland and the Phoney War. 3rd of November, 1939. So, is this the same Molotov that the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact is named after? I'm assuming it is. Very distinct looking guy. Let's go.
November 3rd. November 3rd, 1939. You've been at war for 2 months, but you haven't fought. Sure, the odd skirmish, naval encounter, or aerial dogfight, but no big battles, either offensive or defensive. For many of the British and French, this was no longer a real war. It was a phony war.
That seems like a ridiculous thing for hearing from hindsight, but it's so difficult, at least for me, I won't speak for everyone, to put myself in the shoes of people, even at this point of the war, where you're not positive that this is going to erupt in a giant world war. You're not sure if maybe, there's a standstill between the lowland countries and France and the Germans, and then there's some consolidation of territory, more so in Eastern Europe, maybe. And maybe it stops there, and then you have to work out in the coming decades what to do with the Polish people and whatnot. But even now, in 1939, it's not a sure thing that this is going to explode into the most devastating conflict ever. Let me know if you disagree.
This is World War II. Last week, decrees went out in German-controlled Poland, not only for conscripted labor, but guidelines for general behavior. Hitler aired his future plans for fighting Russia, and the first discussions for an ultimate weapon, an atomic bomb, were held in Washington. But this week, there were a lot more discussions going on back in Europe. In fact, negotiations between the Finns and the Soviets had been by now in progress for weeks, but the Finns still refused to agree to Soviet territorial demands.
Hold on. What if the Germans didn't invade in the West and just, again, the Germans and Soviets kind of consolidated power in the East, and then Germany just went right after the Soviets? At that point, I'm wondering how countries like France and the UK would react, because they're not exactly giant fans of either the Germans or the Soviets. And so I'm wondering if maybe they would kind of sit on the sideline and see how it plays out, maybe, or maybe reinforce Scandinavia.
The Soviets have been pretty cordial so far, but on November 3rd, Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov drops his mask. Since we civilians don't seem to be making any progress, perhaps it's the soldiers' turn to speak. Well, he had already sort of dropped it just as he was heading for this week's round of negotiations in a speech that went out to the whole world. From who does Finland hope to get help? Poland too had a guarantee. The meeting on the 3rd was again a stalemate. The Finns were not going to give up Hanko on the Finnish mainland and at the mouth of the Gulf of Finland under any circumstances. And if you're wondering what the overall territorial claims I mentioned a few weeks ago would look like if they were the same for maybe a country you're more familiar with, I read this in the Winter War. It came from the Foreign Ministry's White Book. If it were Britain to whom the demands were being made, it would mean giving up the Isle of Wight and the Channel Islands. In the north, the enemy would get to fortify the Orkney and Shetland Islands, and the British border would have to move inland from Norfolk about 80 kilometers, ruining British defenses. The Finns were worried about becoming a subject people and all that might entail. The Poles are by now a subject people, but that wasn't really good enough in general for Nazi ideology. If you're going to have a subject people, you really had to create a master race. This week, on October 28th, Heinrich Himmler issued a procreation order to the SS. It would be the task of German
Reichsführer of the Schutzstaffel.
women issued a procreation order to the SS. It would be the task of German women and girls of good blood to become mothers of children to soldiers setting off for battle. But this was going to become organized in a system. Lebensborn were essentially human stud farms where young girls, carefully selected, could procreate with the SS men. Maternity homes would be set up for the children, who would, of course, be specially treated. As for those on the other end of the treatment spectrum, on November 1st, German propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels visits Rhode, and he wrote his thoughts concerning the city's Jews, some 200,000 of them. It is indescribable. They are no longer people, but beasts. There is therefore not a humanitarian, but a surgical task. Here, one must make a radical incision. Otherwise, Europe will be ruined by the Jewish sickness. That same day, a magazine in Berlin wrote, "Behind all the enemies of Germany's ascendancy stand those who demand our encirclement, the oldest enemies of the German people and of all healthy rising nations, the Jews." Yep, behind all their enemies. But it wasn't just Jews, as we've seen, that are subject to terror in Poland. On the last day of the week, 96 Polish schoolteachers from Ripon are summoned by the Gestapo, arrested, and then shot dead. As you may imagine, the main job of the Polish government in exile was to perform the reorganization of the Polish armed forces. The Navy was fairly easy to do, partly because there weren't that many ships, but since they were only going to work with the British, negotiations were relatively simple. The ships would be operationally under command of the British Admiralty, but internally they would remain Polish with Polish crews. Things like supplies and repairs and even salaries were paid by the British as a loan to the Polish government for however long the war lasted. At first, this was all just for the Polish destroyer division, but in November, the Poles placed all ships, including merchant ones, and all personnel at British disposal. And since Britain could really use some extra ships, the Poles had work to do right away. Already in October, the destroyers were sent to patrol the western coast of Ireland. The British...
I feel like of all the countries, if World War II was a movie, I feel like Poland would be the protagonist. If you were just to make like the best story of World War II, and that they were hopelessly surrounded by two giant powers in the very beginning of the war, crushed, pushed to exile, I guess exile, or, you know, keeping as much of the Polish government together over to Britain. And then I'm pretty sure that a lot of brave, or, you know, the brave Polish soldiers served in the Allies fighting against Europe, and eventually, in the end, getting your country back. The only problem is, which is really infuriating, the more I think about it, is that Poland, World War II ended with Poland under the occupation again of one of their original occupiers in the Soviet Union, and that is incredibly angering for me. I understand the Soviets were a giant part. They lost the most people and were a giant part in bringing down the Germans. You could easily argue the most important part of bringing down the Germans, and I understand that. But they were also one of the aggressors, and for Poland. And for Poland to end for another few decades under Soviet control is so saddening and frustrating, angering.
The destroyers were sent to patrol the western coast of Ireland. The British government is worried that the IRA might allow German subs to resupply there, but going there themselves would violate Irish neutrality, which might have big repercussions with the Americans and their large Irish community. So they send the Poles to do it. Rebuilding the army and the air force will take much more time. But Poland's allies have armies and air forces, and they aren't doing much at all. The Phoney War, or the Boer War, is really a thing by now. This was war without war. Britain and France were at war with Germany, but other than a few skirmishes the French had had in early September, there was no fighting. Poland had fallen, so the fight their governments had committed them to left many French and British feeling that this was futile. What was now the point in being at war?
This really shows the unfortunate reality of treaties and military alliances. It's that I'm not saying that they're worthless, right? But at the end of the day, no matter how concrete and assured the alliance is, if coming to the defense of a country you promised to defend could very much end in a way that would be even worse than the trust you lose in the eyes of the world and not following your orders. But if it's too risky, then it's not going to follow through.
The French army was deployed with the British on the left, but they had no offensive plans. Absolutely not until they were better armed anyhow. Heck, even that deployment had hitches because of Belgian neutrality. Everyone assumes that if Germany attacks in the West, it will be through Belgium like in 1914. But Belgium's King Leopold is damn sure not going to give the Germans a pretext for doing so by admitting Allied troops to neutral Belgian land. So by now, the Allies are building defenses on the French border that they plan to abandon if and when Germany does attack. The British do not have a large reserve of trained men anyhow. Plans for limited conscription had only been approved in May, and full conscription didn't begin until Britain had already joined the war. That was just 2 months ago. So they could really only provide fairly limited ground and air forces to aid the French. France had begun to prepare for war before the British, but they were still awaiting delivery of loads of tanks and aircraft. So at this point, even had they had the will to do so, the two couldn't really have taken on the Wehrmacht or run a big aerial campaign against Germany. That's if they had wanted to.
How was a country that was destroyed and defeated in World War I and incredibly damaging implications for the German economy and people, how did you allow them to become this? That's such a frustrating statement right there, that even if they had the willpower to fight the Germans, they still couldn't stand up against the Wehrmacht. The Wehrmacht, the army of a country that was defeated 20 years ago by you, is now stronger than you?
Thing is, a lot of their leaders are convinced that they have time on their side. The British want to blockade Germany by sea as they had in the First World War. But that took several years to be effected. Maurice Gamelin, the commander-in-chief of the French armed forces, talks about having a big offensive in 1941 or even 1942. Some people in government think that Hitler and the Nazis will be overthrown by more sensible Germans. And they have other worries at home besides just the Germans. The French have a paranoia about the communists who could be Stalinist tools. Last month, 35 communist members of parliament were actually detained, members of parliament detained in the interest of French national security. But France wasn't even at war with the Soviet Union. Still, now in November and over the coming winter months, thousands of communist activists will also be interned. But it is the inactivity that really preys on public sentiment. In the minds of many French and British people, the war effort seemed purposeless. Their nations were committed to fight, yet were not fighting. But where would that fight be? If you think the French are itching for a rematch of 1914 on their own territory, you can think again. Yet, with the economic strain of keeping 2.7 million men under arms, equipped and fed, they kind of feel they have to do something. They propose things like a Balkan front to preempt any German activity there. But the British nixed that because that might make the Italians join the Germans. And being so passive is just wearing on the men's morale. I found a quote from British Corps Commander Alan Brooke when watching a French army parade in November 1939 when Max Hastings' all hell let loose. Seldom have I seen anything more slovenly. Men unshaven, horses ungroomed, complete lack of pride in themselves or their units. What shook me most, however, was the look in the men's faces. Disgruntled and insubordinate looks. I could not help wondering whether the French are still a firm enough nation to again take their part in seeing this war through.
This is what it feels like. It feels like all of the winning nations of World War I truly believed, like, that's the end of war. That we just fought the last war and we won. Okay, Oh, Germany's rearming. Oh, they took Austria. Yeah. Oh, they're taking part of Czechoslovakia. Okay, they're taking the rest. Oh. Well, if they attack Poland, then they better watch. They just invaded Poland. Yeah, but we just fought the last war. War's over. That's what it feels like. It really does.
With that, I will end this week of the war. Perhaps a phony war. The Finns still refusing the Soviets, but the Soviets losing patience. The Germans actively beginning a procreation program. A dehumanizing one, but one that ideally produces a desired type of human. The British and the French bored because they were at war, but there was no war. Now, I can imagine sitting around your defenses week after week as autumn rains grow colder and colder, and you miss your homes, your families, you miss your friends. I can imagine that you may long for some action to break the monotony. But be careful what you wish for. You may get it. If you want to understand more about how the Nazi thinking about race and procreation was influenced by pseudoscience from the 19th century, have a look at our dictionary episode about Ottmar von Verschuer, a
Like Indiana Jones stuff?
Nazi doctor and scientist. It is right here. And please support our war effort by joining the Time Ghost Army on Patreon. See you next time.
Okay. Let me know if you disagree, guys. But the big message that this sends is that don't go too far in punishing a nation that you defeat. I think this is, it's not really Metternichian, because Metternichian post-war foreign policy was more about making sure a country isn't too weak after they're defeated so that other countries can't take advantage of that vacuum of power. So it's not really that. It's more, don't let defeated countries get too weak, or don't punish defeated countries too much, because you are going to allow the most autocratic and evil people to have a point when they go to the other people and be like, look how much they unfair they were. And then the rest of the population is going to be like, yeah, they're right. So it's almost like a message I'm getting from this is punishing an enemy too much after a war could lead to more war. Or in other words, a measured approach, a measured, reasonable approach to punishing your opponent who you defeated in war can actually avoid war in the future. It seems. Love y'all. Hope you're all doing well. Would appreciate any comments down below. If you disagree with anything I said, call it out. Please say it in the comments. Hopefully I'll see you guys next time. We'll keep on learning. Bye, guys.